Welcome to the Clinical File. I'm John Cordray, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Wade Wilson case. These are my speculations, as not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. Wade Stephen Wilson is a name that has become linked to a specific type of modern darkness. Many recognize him by the skeletal tattoos that mask his face, but the psychological landscape beneath that ink is far more complex than the simple desire for shock value. When we look at this clinical file, we have to confront the profound question about human behavior. Is it possible for a series of physical traumas to essentially rewire a person toward violence? Or are we witnessing the calculated evolution of a predator who used his perceived brokenness as a weapon? This mental health analysis is going to look into the documented history of brain trauma, the progression of antisocial behavior, and the specific psychological indicators that suggest a chilling level of emotional detachment. We'll examine why this individual crossed the line from a career criminal to a double homicide offender in a single morning. Wade Wilson was born on May 20th, 1994, to teenage parents who were unable to care for him. He was adopted by Steve and Candace Wilson and raised in Tallahassee, Florida. While he grew up in what appeared to be a stable home and attended high school, his youth was marked by a series of significant red flag events. One of the most critical psychological indicators in Wilson's history is a documented pattern of repeated traumatic brain injury. During his 2024 trial, his defense team highlighted at least 4 major concussions that occurred during his youth, stemming from sports injuries and vehicle accidents. From a professional counseling perspective, we must look at how these injuries impact the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the command center for executive function, responsible for managing impulse control, social behavior, and the ability to understand the consequences of one's actions. When the frontal lobe is compromised, an individual can experience affective dysregulation. This means the internal brakes that usually prevent a person from acting on aggressive or violent impulses are essentially non-functional. But we also have to look at the timeline. By the time Wilson was in his late teens, his behavior had already transitioned from troubled youth to a consistent pattern of criminal activity. Between 2012 and 2018, Wilson's criminal record grew to include burglary, grand theft, and firearm offenses. In 2013, he was sentenced to prison for burglary and grand theft, serving nearly a year. This brings us to a significant clinical observation: the transition from petty crime to serious violent offenders. The transition from petty crime to serious violent offenses is a hallmark indicator of antisocial personality disorder. Individuals with ASPD demonstrate a pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others and a total failure to conform to societal norms. In my practice, we look for signs of remorse or an ability to learn from past consequences. In Wilson's case, the opposite occurred. His history shows a lack of rehabilitation, suggesting that he didn't view his actions through a moral lens, but rather saw the law as an obstacle to be bypassed for personal gratification. A shocking element of his past is a 2015 case where he was charged with sexual battery and kidnapping. Although he was eventually acquitted, the nature of these allegations suggests a behavioral pattern involving the luring and control of others. Control is a central theme in Wilson's psychological profile here. On the night of October 6, 2019, Wilson met 35-year-old Christine Melton at a bar in Fort Myers. They eventually went back to her home in Cape Coral. This initial meeting is a classic example of social engineering. Wilson was able to present himself as a non-threatening, socially competent individual to gain Christine's trust. In clinical terms, this ability to mask one's intentions is a common trait in high-functioning predators. While Christine was asleep on the morning of October 7th, Wilson strangled her to death in her own bed. Manual strangulation is a deeply personal and prolonged act of violence. It requires minutes of sustained physical effort. Psychologically, this suggests a need for total dominance over the victim. It's a crime that offers the perpetrator a significant window of time to stop, yet Wilson chose to continue. This suggests a total absence of empathy, the ability to feel or recognize the suffering of another. Following the murder, Wilson's behavior was remarkably devoid of panic or guilt we would expect from a crime of passion. He didn't flee or call for help. Instead, he stole Kristen's car and immediately drove to find an ex-girlfriend at her place of employment in Fort Myers. When he arrived, covered in blood, and she refused to get into the vehicle, he attacked her. This behavior is a massive indicator of behavioral escalation. Wilson was not hiding. He was actively seeking further conflict and potential victims. This state of high arousal predation is often seen in individuals who feel a sense of narcissistic tendencies. It's a belief that they are untouchable and that their desires supersede all other laws. The most jarring element of the case occurred shortly after the second assault. Wilson encountered a 43-year-old Diane as she was walking to her job in Cape Coral. He used a simple request for directions to lure her into the vehicle. This is a stark example of opportunistic predation, where the perpetrator identifies a vulnerable target and strikes without hesitation. Inside the car, Wilson strangled Diane, but the violence reached a level of depravity that shocked even veteran investigators. After pushing her out of the vehicle and realizing she was still breathing, Wilson got back into the car and ran her over repeatedly. He later told his biological father, Stephen, that he ran her over until she looked like spaghetti. In clinical psychology, we call this overkill. Overkill occurs when the amount of violence used far exceeds what is necessary to end a life. It's often seen as an expression of extreme rage or a total lack of human recognition for the victim. To Wilson, Diane had ceased to be a human being. She was an object to be flattened. Can we truly distinguish between a broken brain and a broken moral compass when the violence is this excessive? While in custody awaiting trial, Wilson began to cover his face in tattoos, including swastikas, stitches across his mouth, and a skeletal jawline. This transformation is a significant psychological marker, often viewed as identity fragmentation. By turning his face into a mask of death, Wilson was likely aligning his external appearance with his internal sense of deviance. It acts as a visual declaration that he has completely rejected society and its moral constraints. During the June 2024 trial, the defense leaned heavily on expert testimony from a forensic neuropsychologist. He testified that Wilson's brain was compromised and that he suffered from neurocognitive impairment that hindered his judgment. However, the prosecution countered with experts like a medical examiner who testified that Wilson's brain scan showed a structurally normal adult brain. This conflict highlights a major debate in forensic psychology, whether a person's behavior is a result of biological malfunction or a series of calculated choices. Wilson's behavior may be better explained by what is called malignant narcissism. It's where an individual feels a sense of godlike tendencies and finds gratification in total destruction of others. Narcissism at this level often serves as a mask of void of identity, which is replaced by a constant need for power. Wilson's actions after the crime further solidified the profile of a man lacking empathy. He confessed to his biological father on the phone with a sense of an excitement. His father testified that the enthusiasm in Wade's voice was the most terrifying part of the conversation. This post-offense behavior is a significant red flag. Most individuals experience fear or shock after a traumatic event, but Wilson seemed to enjoy the notoriety. He even claimed to the media that he was part of a high-level human trafficking ring and was being framed. This is characteristic of a pathological liar. Pathological lying is a defense mechanism used to shift blame and create a narrative where the perpetrator is the central, misunderstood protagonist of a grand story. It highlights a desperate need to be seen as significant, even through the lens of a villain. Throughout the trial, Wilson often sat with a smirk or a look of boredom while graphic evidence was presented. This emotional blunting is a primary indicator of psychopathy. Individuals with high scores on a psychopathy checklist don't process emotional stimuli the way most people do. Where others feel visceral horror or sadness, they may feel a sense of accomplishment or nothing at all. What does it say about the human psyche when a person can look at the results of their own carnage and remain completely unmoved? This disconnect from empathy is perhaps the most dangerous trait a human can possess because it removes the internal barriers to harming others. One of the most perplexing parts of this case is the public reaction. Since his trial began, Wilson gained a massive following online, particularly among women who sent him letters and money. This is known as hybristophilia, a psychological phenomenon where individuals are attracted to those who commit gruesome crimes. It often stems from a distorted desire to fix or nurture a perceived monster. For a manipulator like Wilson, this attention is just another resource to exploit. Even from death row, he has attempted to engage in relationships with staff and has been disciplined for tablet violations and trying to auction off his artwork. This indicates that his need for control and manipulation did not end with his conviction. He remains in disciplinary confinement, still pushing the boundaries of the system. In my professional analysis, Wade Wilson represents the extreme end of the antisocial spectrum. Whether his personality was forged by biological trauma or a deep-seated sense of entitlement, the result was a man who saw no boundary between his desires and the lives of others. The murders of Kristen and Diane were the final violent expressions of a man who had spent his life devaluing the world around him. As we close this clinical file, we must reflect on the red flags, the TBI, the early criminality, and the lack of impulse control, and consider how we can better identify these traits before they lead to such irreversible loss. We remember Kristen and Diane, whose futures were stolen by a man who chose to be a predator. This is a really fascinating case with so many different psychological layers. There are physical evidence of brain trauma and concussions. We know that traumatic brain injury can cause a lot of psychosis and other mental health indicators like this case. It's very similar in other cases as well. But it's hard to know exactly between was it biological or was it something that it was innate in Wade? Was it something in his childhood that really brought out the indicators of psychopathy? We may not really know the history of this case, but we can certainly look at his behaviors during the crime, during the trial, and what's going on now. And we can pretty safely speculate that Wade has a psychopathy. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.